She gave her last loaf of bread to a bruised stranger being laughed at by her boss, never guessing the tramp was a feared mafia kingpin hiding in plain sight. Another day, another fight to keep the floors spotless. Janet Millie moved through the bakery in her dark blue scrubs, mop in hand, invisible to everyone around her, until the door chimed and a man stumbled in who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His coat was torn at the shoulder. His hands were shaking. He set a single loaf of bread on the counter and reached into his pocket and came up empty. I must have left my wallet, he said quietly. Please, just give me a moment. The cashier didn't even try to hide her laugh. She pointed at him, loud enough for the whole store to hear. Sir, if you can't pay, you need to step aside. We don't do charity here. The manager appeared behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes cold. Put it down and get out. You're scaring the customers. Janet stopped mopping. She watched the man's hollow eyes drop to the floor, watched him start to turn away in silence. No argument, no anger, just the quiet defeat of a man who expected nothing better from the world. She walked to the register and pulled the last $3 out of her pocket. I've got it, she said. The manager blinked. Janet, you don't have to. It's my money, my choice. She slid the bill across the counter and handed the man his bread herself, gently, like it mattered. Here you go. The man stared at her like no one had looked at him that way in years. You don't even know me. I know you're hungry, Janet said, and I know nobody should have to feel ashamed for it. What's your name? Janet Millie. Something shifted behind his eyes, something sharp and unreadable, gone as quickly as it appeared. Janet Millie, he repeated, like he was memorizing it for a reason she couldn't possibly understand. I won't forget that. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I love seeing that. And if you're the kind of person who believes one small act of kindness can flip somebody's whole life upside down, hit like and subscribe right now, because Janet's story is about to prove exactly that. The bell above the door hadn't even stopped ringing before the manager rounded on her. My office, now. Janet followed him past the display cases, past the customers pretending not to stare, into a back room that smelled like stale coffee and disappointment. You interfered with a transaction, he said flatly. You inserted yourself into something that wasn't your business. You used store product without full payment authorization. I paid for it myself, Janet said, with my own money. That's not the point. Employees do not grandstand on the sales floor. They looked at her scrubs like dirt, unaware she'd just bought the loyalty of a king. Grandstand? Janet's voice cracked, disbelief cutting through her usual quiet. That man was starving. He was being mocked in front of a full store. I handed him bread. That's not a scene, that's being human. Being human isn't in the handbook, Janet. For a moment, something almost like guilt crossed his face. I like you, you're a good worker, but rules are rules. This is a termination, effective immediately. Please, her voice dropped, all the fight draining into desperation. My little brother, Michael, he's 7. I'm all he has, if I lose this job. The decision is final. You can collect your last check Friday. Janet stood there a moment longer, waiting for the words to change, for someone to say this was a mistake. No one did. She thought she was losing everything, unaware she'd just bought the loyalty of a king. She walked home through Pilsen with empty pockets and a hollow chest, rehearsing how she'd tell Michael there'd be no dinner tonight, wondering how $3 and 1 loaf of bread had cost her everything she had left. She had no way of knowing that 2 blocks away, in a room she would never be allowed to enter, the man in the torn coat was peeling off a false layer of dirt and bruises like a second skin, revealing a face that made grown men flinch when they saw it. Sir, a guard in black knelt low, head bowed. Your ribs should we call for? Later. Oh, Sihun rolled his shoulder, testing the wound Minjun's men had left him with weeks ago. His voice, when it came, was nothing like the broken whisper he'd used at the bakery counter. Find her. Find who? Janet Millie. He said the name slowly, like it was something worth keeping. A cleaning girl, dark scrubs, worked at the bakery on Halden Street. His eyes moved to the window, to the city lights he hadn't seen properly in weeks. In this world, kindness like that doesn't go unanswered. Find out everything about her life, then bring her to me. A mafia boss doesn't forget a favor, especially when he was starving. Somewhere across that same city, in an apartment with a broken heater and a stack of unpaid bills, Janet Milley had no idea that the empty bakery register, where she'd spent her last $3, had just become the most valuable investment of her life. Next time, the black cars arrive on her street, and the man she fed a stranger's kindness turns out to be the one man who can save her family, or destroy everything she's ever known. The black sedans came 3 days later, parked just far enough down the block that Janet almost convinced herself she was imagining them, if not for the way the streetlight caught the glint of a man's watch every time he lifted his wrist to check the time. She noticed them from her kitchen window, over the sink, over the same 3 dishes she'd been rewashing just to have something to do with her hands. 2 cars, 4 men, no plates she recognized. They didn't move, didn't approach, just watched the building the way a hawk watches a field before it decides there's nothing worth diving for. Janet pulled the curtain shut and pressed her back against the wall, heart thudding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Michael was at the kitchen table, 7 years old and hunched over a coloring book like the world hadn't just tilted sideways. "Who's out there?" he asked, not even looking up. "Nobody, baby," she made herself smile. "Finish your dinosaur." It wasn't nobody. It hadn't been nobody for 3 days, not since Mr. Ferris from Unit 2B started whispering about men asking questions around the block, about a woman in dark blue scrubs, about where she worked, where she shopped, who she talked to. Janet told herself it was the loan sharks. Ricky Domings and his crew had been circling Pilsen for months, buying up debt from anybody desperate enough to sell it, and half her neighbors owed somebody something. It made sense that it was them. It had to be them. The alternative, that somebody dangerous had taken a personal interest in her, specifically, for reasons she couldn't name, was too much to hold on to while also holding on to rent money she didn't have. 6 job applications this week. 6 polite rejections, or worse, no response at all, which was its own kind of rejection, the kind that told you exactly how invisible you were. The bakery had given her a reference that read more like a warning label, left prior position due to policy violation. Nobody wanted to hire a woman who couldn't follow the rules, even when the rule she'd broken was buying a hungry man a piece of bread. She counted the cash in the coffee tin above the fridge for the 4th time that night, like the numbers might change if she just wanted it badly enough. $211. Rent was due in 9 days. Michael needed new shoes. His toes were already pressing against the canvas of the ones he had, and there was a stack of mail on the counter she'd stopped opening because she already knew what was inside. She sat down across from her brother and watched him color a purple triceratops with a focus so pure it nearly broke her heart. This was the part nobody warned you about, not the poverty itself, but the constant, grinding math of it. How much can I sacrifice before he notices? How long can I protect him from knowing how close we are to the edge? Michael looked up suddenly, crayon still moving on the page. "Are we gonna have to move again?" The question landed like a stone in still water. He remembered the last move, 2 years ago, after their mother's funeral bills ate through what little savings existed, remembered sleeping on a cousin's pull-out couch for 6 weeks, remembered not understanding why, but understanding enough to be scared. "No," Janet said, and meant it with everything she had, even though she had no earthly idea how she was going to keep that promise. "I'm going to take care of us. I always do." He nodded slowly, the way kids do when they're choosing to believe you because the alternative is too heavy to carry. Then he went back to his dinosaur, and Janet went back to the window, and the sedans were still there. Across the city, in a part of Chicago that didn't appear on any tourist map, O.C. Hun stood shirtless in front of a mirror in a compound hidden behind 3 layers of security, watching a doctor stitch the last of the wounds Min Jun's men had carved into him during the ambush that was supposed to end his life. "You should be resting," the doctor muttered, not for the first time. I've rested enough. Sihun's voice was flat, controlled, nothing like the broken whisper he'd used at the bakery counter 3 days ago. That voice had been a costume. This one was the man underneath, the one who had built an empire out of nothing and nearly lost it to a man he'd trained with his own hands. 2 of his lieutenants stood near the door, waiting for permission to speak. He gave it with a glance. 3 of Minjun's safe houses cleared, one of them reported. The warehouse on Blue Island cleared. He's scattering, moving faster than we expected. He knows you're alive. Good, Sihun said. Let him be afraid. Fear makes men sloppy. He flexed his hand, testing the stitches along his forearm, watching a bead of blood rise and fall back beneath the thread. What about the girl? The room went quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet that happens when men who deal exclusively in violence are asked to speak about something gentler, something they don't have language for. We found her, the second lieutenant said carefully. Janet Milley, 26. Worked as janitorial staff at the Halden Street Bakery, terminated the day she helped you, raising a younger brother alone, no criminal record, no family with syndicate ties, no debts to us or anyone connected to us. He paused. She's clean, sir, completely clean. Sihun said nothing for a long moment, staring at his reflection like it belonged to someone else. Someone who 3 days ago had been starving, humiliated, invisible, and had been seen anyway, by the one person in that entire store with nothing to gain from seeing him. Why would a woman with nothing left to spare choose to spend it on a stranger who could offer her absolutely nothing in return? It was a question that had followed him out of that bakery and into every hour since, and it unsettled him more than the ambush had. Men in his world didn't do kindness without calculation. He'd forgotten that some people simply weren't built that way. Watch her, he said finally. Discreetly, I don't want her frightened before I decide how to approach this. Sir, respectfully, Ricky Domings's people have already been circling that block. Lone sharks. They may move on her building before you're ready to move at all. Sihun's jaw tightened, something cold and immediate flickering behind his eyes, the look of a man recalculating a plan in real time. Then we move faster. He reached for the clean shirt draped across the chair, wincing as the fabric pulled against the stitches. A debt like this doesn't get paid in flowers and a thank you card. It gets paid properly, or it doesn't get paid at all. He looked at both men, and for the first time since the ambush, something almost like purpose steadied his voice. Find out exactly what Janet Milley needs to feel safe again, then make sure she has it before she even knows to ask. Back in Pilsen, Janet finally pulled the curtain closed for the night, checked the lock twice, and sat in the dark listening to her brothers breathing even out into sleep in the next room. The sedans were gone by midnight. She'd checked, obsessively, every 20 minutes, but the fear they'd left behind didn't leave with them. It sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving, whispering that whatever was circling her life wasn't finished circling yet. She had no way of knowing that somewhere across the city, a man she'd fed out of pure instinct, no calculation, no hope of reward, had just given an order that would tear her ordinary, exhausted, dignified little life apart and rebuild it into something she never asked for and wasn't sure she wanted. The knock came at 6:47 the next morning. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, unhurried, the knock of someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how much she didn't. Janet stood frozen in her hallway, one hand on Michael's bedroom doorframe, staring at the door like it might tell her, before she opened it, whether it was about to save her life or end it. If Janet's story has you sitting on the edge of your seat right now, I want you to do something for me. Don't just watch this quietly. Drop a comment right now and tell that manager, tell Minjun, tell every person in this world who's ever laughed at someone struggling, tell them dignity isn't for sale and it never will be. That's how we stand with Janet. And if you love stories like this one, stories about ordinary women who carry more strength than the world ever gives them credit for, I want to put something in your hands. There's a novel collection waiting for you right now, 2 unforgettable stories about love, loss, and the kind of hope that survives the worst of circumstances. One will break your heart, the other will heal it. The link is in the description and pinned comment below. go grab it. It downloads instantly, and there's a free audiobook included. And if you're watching this on your TV tonight, just grab your phone and scan the QR code right there on your screen. Go on now. Go find your next story. Janet opened the door expecting a bill collector, a landlord's notice, maybe worse, and instead found her hallway filling with a light she didn't recognize, the kind that came off a suit tailored so precisely it seemed to bend the air around it. She almost didn't recognize him. The torn brown coat was gone. The bruises, the dirt, the hollow, starving look in his eyes, all of it had been washed away and replaced by a man who stood in her doorway like he owned the building, the block, possibly the city itself. Charcoal suit, polished shoes that had never touched a Pilsen sidewalk before this morning. And behind him, filling the narrow hallway of her walk-up, 4 men in black who didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't do anything except watch every direction at once like they were paid to expect danger from all of them. "You," Janet breathed, one hand still braced on the doorframe, the other instinctively moving to block the space behind her, toward Michael's room. "You're the man from the bakery." "I am." His voice was different too, steady, deep, carrying an authority that hadn't been there when he was begging for a moment's grace at a cash register. "My name is Oh Si-hun. I owe you a debt, Miss Millie, and I intend to pay it." Outside, she could hear her neighbors' doors cracking open one by one, the unmistakable creak of Mrs. Alvarez's hinges, the low murmur of Mr. Ferris already on the phone with somebody, narrating the black SUVs parked outside like a man reporting a UFO landing. Janet felt her face heat with humiliation before she even understood what was happening. This was Pilsen. Nobody's block got this kind of attention unless something terrible was coming. "I don't want trouble," she said quietly, firmly, the way she'd learned to speak to men who thought their presence alone should move her. "I have a little brother in the next room. Whatever this is, I need you to leave." Something shifted in his expression, not offense, but something closer to respect. "You misunderstand me. I'm not here to bring trouble to your door, Miss Millie. I'm here to remove it." He glanced past her briefly, toward the sound of a small television playing cartoons too loud in the next room, and something almost gentle crossed his face before it hardened again into business. "May I come in? 5 minutes. If you still want me gone after that, I will go, and you will never see me again." Every instinct in Janet's body told her to shut the door. She'd read enough, seen enough of the world, to know that men who arrived with security details and unreadable faces did not show up at 7 in the morning with good intentions. But there was something underneath his composure that she recognized, the same thing she'd seen in his eyes at the bakery counter, buried under the dirt and the desperation. A kind of exhausted honesty. Whatever else this man was, she didn't believe he was lying to her right now. 5 minutes, she said, and your men wait outside. He nodded once, and the men in black peeled back into the hallway without a word, like they'd been trained to disappear on command. Inside her small living room, the second-hand couch, the water stain on the ceiling she'd been meaning to report for a year, the stack of unopened mail she quickly turned face down on the counter, Si-hun looked entirely out of place, and yet he didn't seem to notice or care. He sat when she gestured to the couch, folded his hands, and looked at her with the kind of directness that made her want to look away and made her unable to. 3 days ago, he said, you spent your last $3 on a man you had every reason to walk past. You lost your job for it. You have been afraid ever since, for good reason, though not the reason you think. He paused. I am not a beggar, Miss Millie. I am chairman of a company with holdings across this city and several others. What you saw at that bakery was a man at the lowest point of his life, hiding from people who wanted him dead. What you're looking at now is closer to the truth of who I am. Janet's stomach dropped. She thought of the sedans outside her building for 3 nights running. She thought of Mr. Ferris's whispers about men asking questions. She thought of every headline she'd ever half read about businessmen whose empires weren't built entirely on paperwork. What kind of company? She said slowly, though some part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. How much of what he was about to offer her would come with strings she couldn't see yet, and would she even recognize them before it was too late? A large one, a complicated one, he said, which told her everything and nothing at once. I have a real estate and urban development division that has been without proper leadership for some time. I want you to run it." For a moment, Janet genuinely thought she'd misheard him. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes out when your body doesn't know whether to be insulted or afraid. "I clean floors. I don't have a business degree. I don't have experience running anything. You have something most executives in that building will never have," he cut in, not unkindly. "You saw a stranger being humiliated and you acted, knowing it would cost you everything you had. That tells me more about your judgment than any diploma could. I don't need a corporate ladder climber, Miss Millie. I need someone who remembers what human life is worth, sitting in a room full of people who have forgotten." Janet sat with that for a long moment, her mind racing through every reason this was insane. The danger radiating off this man despite his calm voice, the neighbors already talking, the sheer impossibility of a janitor being handed the keys to anything, and one single, overwhelming reason it wasn't insane at all. Michael, asleep down the hall, one missed rent payment away from losing the only stability she'd managed to build for him. "And if I say no?" she asked, testing him, needing to know if there was a threat hiding underneath the offer. Something flickered across his face, not anger, but a weariness that told her the world he came from rarely allowed a graceful no. "Then I thank you for your kindness, and my men drive away, and you never see me again." He held her gaze. "But I would be lying if I told you the world you live in is entirely safe right now, regardless of what you decide. There are men circling this neighborhood who have nothing to do with me and everything to do with debts your neighbors owe. I can't erase that danger by walking away from your door. I can only offer you a way to rise above it." Janet thought of the sedans, of Ricky Domings's crew moving through Pilsen like a slow tide, of 9 days until rent, 6 rejected applications, a coffee tin with $211 standing between her family and the street. "I need to think," she whispered. "You have until morning." Sihun stood, buttoning his jacket with the same quiet precision he did everything else. "One of my men will remain outside, out of sight, for your protection, whether you accept or not. That much I owe you regardless of your answer." He walked to the door, then paused, turning back with something almost gentle in his eyes. "For what it's worth, Miss Millie, I have met very few people in my life who gave without calculating what it would cost them. I don't intend to let that go unanswered." The door closed softly behind him. Janet stood in the middle of her living room, heart hammering, staring at the space where a stranger from a bakery counter had just offered to hand her an entire life she'd never imagined wanting. And somewhere down the hall, she heard Michael's small voice call out, sleepy and unaware of everything that had just changed. "Janet, who was that?" She opened her mouth to answer and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she didn't have the words. If you believe Janet deserves every bit of the life that's about to be handed to her, if you believe kindness like hers should never go unanswered, drop "justice for Janet" in the comments right now. Let's flood this thread with it. Let every greedy manager, every Minjun in the world, see exactly how many of us are standing behind her. "That was somebody offering us a way out," Janet finally said, crouching down in front of Michael's sleepy face, smoothing his hair back the way she did when the world felt too big for either of them to explain. "I'll tell you more when I understand it myself, baby. Go on back to sleep." She didn't sleep herself. Not really. She sat at her kitchen table until the sun came up, turning Sihun's offer over in her mind like a stone she couldn't decide was a diamond or a trap. And by the time the light through her window turned from gray to gold, she'd made her choice the only way she knew how, by thinking of Michael's shoes, his empty lunch account, the eviction notice she still hadn't found the courage to open. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She called the number on the card Sihun's man had left on her counter, and by 9 o'clock that morning, a car was waiting outside to take her to a building she'd never once had reason to walk past. The tower rose 40 stories above the loop, all glass and steel, and a lobby so polished Janet could see her own reflection staring back at her, uncertain, out of place, dressed in the only blazer she owned. A thrift store find she'd bought for a job interview 2 years ago and never had occasion to wear again. Nobody in that lobby moved like they belonged to the same world she did. Their shoes alone probably cost more than her rent. She was met at the elevator by a woman with a clipboard who looked her up and down exactly once, filed away some private judgment, and said nothing at all, just led her silently to the top floor, where a boardroom waited behind glass doors thick enough to muffle whatever was being said inside until the moment they opened. The room went quiet the way a room does, when everyone in it has already decided what they think of you before you've said a word. There were perhaps a dozen people seated around the long table, men mostly, a few women, all of them dressed like they'd stepped out of the pages of a magazine Janet had never been invited to read. She recognized none of them, but she recognized the look on their faces immediately because she'd been receiving that particular look her whole life. It said, "You don't belong here, and we're waiting for you to realize it." Si-hun sat at the head of the table, unreadable, and gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Miss Millie will be joining the leadership of our development division, effective today," he said, in the flat, absolute tone of a man who didn't ask permission for his decisions. "I expect her to be treated with the respect owed to her position." Nobody applauded. A few polite nods, stiff as cardboard, rippled around the table. And then a man near the far end rose slightly from his chair, sharp charcoal suit, hair slicked back with military precision, a thin scar cutting a pale line across his jaw that seemed to catch the light on purpose. "Forgive me," he said, voice smooth, almost pleasant, the kind of pleasant that made the hair on Janet's arms rise. "But I want to make sure I understand correctly. This is the janitor from the bakery." "Min-jun," Si-hun said, a warning folded into 2 syllables. "I mean no disrespect." Min-jun's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I only want clarity for the sake of the room. We are discussing a $400 million development portfolio, zoning negotiations, city council relationships built over a decade, and you're placing it in the hands of a woman who, until 3 days ago, mopped floors for $11 an hour." Janet felt every eye in the room settle on her, waiting to see if she would shrink, and every old instinct in her body screamed at her to do exactly that, to look down, apologize for existing, make herself smaller until the discomfort passed. It was the same instinct that had kept her silent through 100 small humiliations over the years, the belief, buried so deep she rarely questioned it, that she was meant to stay invisible in rooms like this one. "1150, she said instead, surprising herself as much as anyone. "And I know the exact square footage of every commercial kitchen in that bakery chain, which vendor overcharges for cleaning supplies by nearly 20%, and which fire exits in 3 of your buildings have been blocked in violation of code for at least 6 months, because I've been the one crawling through the maintenance closets nobody else bothers to open." She let that sit in the silence. "I don't know your zoning laws yet, mister. I'm sorry. I didn't catch your name." "Min-jun," he said, tighter now, the pleasant mask slipping just slightly. "Mr. Min-jun, I don't know your zoning laws yet, but I know buildings. I know exactly where money leaks out of them when nobody's watching, because I've spent 8 years being the person nobody thought to watch." She folded her hands on the table, steadying them so no one would see the tremor underneath. "Give me a week with your maintenance budgets before you decide I don't belong in this room." What exactly had Min-jun lost, all those years ago, that made him so desperate to prove a woman like Janet could never understand power the way he did? Si-hun's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did a flicker of quiet satisfaction, gone as fast as it appeared. Min-jun, for his part, sat back down slowly, studying Janet now with a different kind of attention, the kind a predator gives something it's underestimated once already. The meeting moved on around her after that, figures, projections, names she didn't recognize attached to buildings she'd never seen, and Janet did the only thing she knew how to do in a room full of strangers who didn't want her there. She watched. She'd spent her whole life learning to read rooms from the margins, from behind mop buckets and cleaning carts, invisible enough that people spoke freely in front of her, forgot she existed, revealed things they never meant to. She used that same quiet attention now, cataloging every uncomfortable glance Min-jun exchanged with the man beside him whenever maintenance contracts came up, every subtle way he steered the conversation away from a particular set of buildings on the city's south side. When the meeting finally broke and the room emptied into hallway conversations and clipped goodbyes, Min-jun lingered behind, waiting until the last of the others had filed out before he approached her, close enough that she caught the expensive, sterile scent of his cologne. "You did well in there," he said quietly, and for a moment Janet almost believed it was a compliment. "Better than I expected. That's not a good thing for you." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper, something meant for her ears alone. "You think a title makes you safe, Janitor. In this room, mistakes end in shallow graves. Si-hun's protection only extends as far as his next crisis. Remember that the day it isn't enough." He straightened, smoothed his jacket, and walked away like he hadn't just threatened her life in a boardroom 40 stories above the street, leaving Janet standing alone by the window, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it behind her eyes, staring out at a city that suddenly felt a great deal more dangerous than it had that morning, and realizing, with a cold certainty settling into her stomach, that whatever war was happening beneath the surface of this company, she had just been placed directly in its path. If you're as furious as I am watching Min-jun threaten a woman who has done nothing but survive with dignity, hit subscribe right now, because I promise you, we are not finished with him. Stay with Janet's story, because that man is going to pay for every single family he's ever targeted, and I want you here when it happens. Janet didn't sleep that night either, and by the time she made it home to Pilsen, she'd already decided she wasn't going to sit still and wait for Min-jun's threat to become something worse. She was going to find out exactly what he was hiding, one way or another. The note came 3 days later, slipped into her coat pocket during a crowded elevator ride she couldn't even place. No name, just an address for a diner on the far side of the district, and a time, 7 o'clock, written in a hand so tight and hurried it looked like whoever wrote it had been afraid the pen itself might be watched. Janet almost didn't go. Everything about it felt like a trap dressed up as an opportunity, and she'd learned enough in the past 2 weeks about the world she'd stumbled into to know that traps in this world rarely announce themselves. But she went anyway, because staying home and waiting for danger to find her had never once worked out better than facing it head-on. The diner was the kind of place time had forgotten, cracked vinyl booths, a coffee pot that had clearly been burning the same batch since morning, a bell over the door that rang too loud every time someone came or went. Janet slid into the back booth exactly as instructed and found a woman already waiting there, a stranger in pale blue scrubs not unlike her old uniform, her hands wrapped so tightly around a coffee cup that her knuckles had gone pale. "You're Janet Millie," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "And you are?" Tessa Phillips. I'm a nurse over at Cook County Wellness Clinic. Well, I was before I started asking questions I wasn't supposed to ask." Tessa's eyes kept flicking toward the door every few seconds, toward the window, toward anyone who lingered too long near their booth. It was the same paranoid vigilance Janet had seen in her own reflection lately, the look of someone who'd stopped believing anywhere was fully safe. "I heard you started working for the Ilshin Group, Real Estate Division." Janet went still. "How do you know that?" "Because everyone in this district who's paying attention knows exactly whose company owns half the buildings we work in." Tessa leaned forward, voice dropping low enough that Janet had to lean in too, just to catch it over the clatter of dishes behind the counter. "I need to know if you're one of them, or if you're someone who still cares what happens to people around here." "I clean floors for a living, or I did 3 weeks ago." Janet held the woman's gaze steady. "I don't know what I am yet, but I know I'm not the kind of person who looks away." Something in Tessa's shoulders eased, just slightly, like she'd been holding her breath for this exact answer. She reached into her bag with trembling hands and pulled out a small encrypted drive, sliding it across the table so quickly it seemed to burn her fingers to hold on to it a second longer than necessary. "Take this," she whispered. "If Min-jun finds out I gave you these files, neither of us will see tomorrow morning." Janet's fingers closed around the drive, cold plastic against her palm, and she felt the full weight of what she was being handed settle into her chest. "What's on it?" 18 months of supply chain records from 4 clinics on the south side, including mine. Shipments logged as medical waste disposal that never went to any disposal facility. Insulin and chemotherapy drugs reported as damaged in transit, but the transit records don't match up with any legitimate carrier. Tessa's voice shook, but she kept going, like she'd been carrying this alone for so long that finally speaking it out loud was its own kind of relief. I started noticing it 18 months ago. Patients not getting medication that should have been in stock, shipment numbers that didn't add up. I thought it was a paperwork error at first. Then I found the shell companies. Shell companies, Janet repeated slowly. 3 of them, all registered to addresses that trace back, eventually, if you dig deep enough, to holding companies connected to the Il-Shin syndicate, specifically to a man named Min-jun. Tessa's eyes locked onto hers. He's not just moving real estate, Janet. He's using the clinics as cover to move something through this district, and it isn't medical waste. What exactly was moving through those trucks, disguised as damaged medication, if it wasn't the drugs themselves being stolen and resold? And who on the other end was desperate enough, or powerful enough, to make 18 months of theft disappear without a single official ever asking a question? Janet turned the drive over in her hand, feeling its weight, feeling the full gravity of what she was about to become entangled and settle into her bones. Why me? Why not the police, the FBI, a journalist? Because I tried. Tessa's laugh was brittle, humorless. I called the district attorney's tip line 8 months ago. Nothing happened. I emailed a reporter at the Tribune with half of what I just told you. She never wrote back, and 3 weeks later she was reassigned to a bureau 2 states away, out of nowhere, no explanation. I stopped trusting official channels a long time ago, Janet, but you're inside now. You have access to their financial records, their property filings, the maintenance budgets, the shipping manifests for buildings they own. You can find the paper trail from the inside in a way I never could from the outside. Janet thought of the boardroom, of the way Min-jun had steered every conversation carefully away from a certain set of buildings on the south side, and a cold, sick clarity began forming in her stomach. There's a warehouse project, she said slowly, the pieces sliding together in real time. On the agenda for next month's zoning vote, Min-jun's been pushing hard for a fast-tracked hazardous materials permit over Sihun's objections right in the middle of my neighborhood. He told the board it was for legitimate industrial storage. Tessa's face went pale. That's not industrial storage, Janet. That's a distribution hub. If he gets that warehouse built and zoned before anyone asks the right questions, he'll have a permanent, legal pipeline running straight through Pilsen, hidden behind a permit nobody will ever think to question again. Her hands were shaking so badly now that her coffee cup rattled against its saucer. My whole clinic's supply chain runs through those same trucking routes. If I'm right about what's actually in those shipments, this isn't just theft anymore. The numbers didn't point to real estate. They pointed to human trafficking. The word landed in the small diner booth like something physical, something Janet could feel pressing against her ribs. She thought of Michael, 7 years old, 3 blocks from where that warehouse would rise. She thought of every family on her street who had no idea their own neighborhood was being quietly turned into cover for something monstrous, dressed up in zoning paperwork and city council votes nobody outside the boardroom would ever fully understand. I'm not going to let that happen, Janet said, and heard, for the first time since she'd walked into that first boardroom feeling like an intruder, real steel in her own voice. Then you have to be careful. Careful in a way you've never had to be before. Tessa reached across the table and gripped Janet's wrist, urgent, pleading. Min-jun isn't going to fight you with lawyers and paperwork if he thinks you're getting close. Men like him don't lose gracefully. Promise me you'll use everything legally. Build the case so airtight nobody can bury it. So it's not your word against his, it's proof no court or council can ignore. That's the only way either of us walks away from this alive. Janet closed her fingers around the drive one more time, feeling the future rearrange itself around a single decision. I promise, she said quietly. I'm going to build a case so solid it burns that warehouse project to the ground before he ever lays a single brick. The bell over the diner door rang again, sharp and sudden, and both women froze, until it turned out to be nothing more than an elderly man shuffling in out of the cold, utterly unremarkable, utterly unaware of the fear he'd just sent rippling through the back booth. Tessa exhaled shakily, gathered her coat, and stood. Don't contact me directly again, she whispered. I'll find you when it's safe. And Janet, whatever you find on that drive, whatever you do with it, please, for the sake of everyone in that neighborhood, Don't let it disappear the way everything else I've tried has disappeared." She was gone before Janet could answer, slipping out into the cold Chicago night, leaving Janet alone in the booth with a small silver drive that suddenly felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. Heavier than grief, heavier than debt, heavier than every hour she'd spent invisible with a mop in her hands. Because now, for the first time, she held in her palm the power to actually save the only home she'd ever known, if she was brave enough and careful enough to use it before Min-jun realized exactly what. And who was standing in his way. If Janet's story has you holding your breath right now, wondering just how far she's willing to go to protect her community, I want to hand you something else that's going to grip your heart the exact same way. There's a novel collection waiting for you, right now, 2 unforgettable stories about love, loss, and the kind of hope that refuses to die even in the darkest circumstances. One story will break your heart wide open, the other will heal every piece of it back together. Go find the link in the description and the pinned comment. It's an instant download with a free audiobook included, and if you're curled up on your couch watching this on your TV tonight, just lift your phone and scan the QR code right there on your screen. Go get lost in a story tonight the way you're lost in Janet's. You deserve it. That silver drive stayed hidden inside a locked drawer in Janet's apartment for the next 2 weeks, untouched, waiting for the right moment, because Tessa's warning had burned itself into her mind, and Janet knew a case built too fast, on evidence not yet fully understood, would collapse the moment Min-jun's lawyers got their hands on it. So she did the only thing she knew how to do well. She worked. Late nights combing through maintenance budgets. Early mornings, cross-referencing property filings against the shipment routes Tessa had flagged. And in between, she prepared for the presentation that was supposed to be her real proving ground. The quarterly pitch to the city's investment board. The meeting that would decide whether the Il-shin Group's community development initiative received the funding to move forward, or got quietly shelved in favor of Min-jun's warehouse project instead. She'd built the presentation herself, every slide, every figure, staying up past midnight 3 nights running while Michael slept down the hall, pouring into it everything she'd learned crawling through the maintenance closets of buildings nobody else had bothered to understand. Real numbers, real needs, a genuine plan to renovate crumbling housing stock and create jobs in the district she'd grown up in. It was, without question, the best work she had ever produced in her life, and when she walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor that morning, briefcase in hand, blazer pressed, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Ready. The investors were already seated when she arrived, 6 of them, city officials and private capital men in tailored suits who'd flown in from 3 different states, the kind of people whose signatures alone could reshape a neighborhood's future with a single stroke of a pen. Si-hun sat near the back of the room, arms folded, saying nothing, his presence a quiet anchor she'd come to rely on more than she wanted to admit. Min-jun sat closer to the front, calm, unreadable, watching her walk to the podium with an expression that should have warned her something was wrong long before it did. She connected her drive to the display, pulled up her first slide, and began to speak, and within 30 seconds, she knew something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. The numbers on the screen weren't hers. The renovation budget she'd calculated down to the dollar had been inflated by nearly triple, absurd figures that made the whole project look like a reckless boondoggle, rather than the carefully costed plan she'd spent weeks building. The job creation projections had been slashed to a fraction of what she'd actually documented. Community testimonials she'd personally collected, real voices from real families in Pilsen, had been stripped out entirely, replaced with generic corporate language that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd never once set foot in the neighborhood. The screen flashed numbers she had never written, setting a trap designed to ruin her in front of every single person whose approval she needed. Janet's mouth went dry. Somewhere in the room, one of the investors let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Another leaned toward his colleague and murmured something behind his hand, not quiet enough to hide the word amateur from reaching her ears. She felt the old, familiar instinct rising in her chest, the instinct to shrink, to apologize, to mumble something about technical difficulties, and slip quietly out of the room before the humiliation swallowed her whole, the same instinct that had kept her invisible and safe behind a mop bucket for 8 years. She looked up and for one terrible second found Min-jun's eyes across the room. He wasn't even trying to hide it. A small, satisfied smile played at the corner of his mouth, the expression of a man watching a trap close exactly the way he'd designed it to close. How long had he been planning this? Was this the first time he'd sabotaged her work, or simply the first time she'd noticed? Janet's hand hovered over the laptop, and for a breath, the whole room seemed to hold still, waiting to see whether the janitor from the bakery would crumble the way everyone in that room had already decided she would. She closed the laptop. The gesture was so sudden, so final, that the murmuring in the room stopped instantly. Every eye turned toward her, waiting. "These numbers aren't mine," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steady, not loud, not defensive, just true. "Someone altered this presentation before I walked into this room, and I won't stand up here and read you figures I know to be false just to save myself embarrassment. I respect you all too much for that, and frankly, I respect the people of my neighborhood far more." Nobody spoke. Min-jun's smile had frozen in place, uncertain now, watching her instead of enjoying his own handiwork. "I've spent 8 years cleaning buildings in this city that men like the ones in this room never once thought to walk through themselves," Janet continued, stepping around the podium, closer to the table, needing them to see her without a screen between them. "I know exactly what's wrong with the housing on Blue Island Avenue, because I've mopped the floors of the clinic 3 blocks from it and watched mothers carry their bobbies through mold that should have been remediated a decade ago. I know that the community center on 21st Street has been operating without proper heat for 2 winters, because I fixed the boiler myself, off the clock, because nobody else was going to. I know these numbers not because I read them off a spreadsheet somebody handed me, but because I have lived every single line item in that budget with my own hands." She let that settle in the silence, watching something shift in the faces around the table, the polite condescension slowly giving way to something more attentive, more uncertain. "I won't read lies to win your money. Here is what this neighborhood actually needs." She began speaking without a single slide to guide her, pulling figures directly from memory, from months of first-hand knowledge no consultant's report could have replicated, the real cost of renovating the housing stock, the real number of families who'd be displaced if nothing changed, the real jobs that could be created if the investment went where it was supposed to go instead of into Min-jun's warehouse. She spoke of Mrs. Alvarez, 3 doors down from her own apartment, raising 2 grandchildren on a fixed income in a building with a leaking roof the landlord refused to fix. She spoke of Michael, 7 years old, and how the difference between a neighborhood that thrived and one that was abandoned to decay wasn't measured in spreadsheets, but in whether a child could grow up believing the world had a place for him. By the time she finished, 10 minutes later, with nothing but her own voice and her own memory to carry her, the room was utterly silent, the kind of silence that comes not from discomfort, but from genuine, unguarded attention. One of the investors, an older woman near the head of the table who hadn't spoken a single word through the entire ordeal, finally set down her pen. "Miss Millie," she said slowly, "that was the most honest pitch I've heard in this room in 15 years. She glanced toward the others, a few of whom were nodding now, something like respect settling into expressions that had been amused just minutes earlier. "I'd like to see the real numbers. Send them to my office by Friday, and we'll discuss terms." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Janet stood at the front of the room, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, hardly able to believe what had just happened, that the very sabotage designed to destroy her had instead handed her the one thing no polished presentation ever could have. Proof, in front of the people who mattered most, that she was exactly who Si-hun had claimed she was. Min-jun's smile from the shadows had vanished entirely by the time she looked back toward him, replaced by something colder, sharper, a man recalculating in real time how badly he'd misjudged his opponent, believing, until moments ago, that he had finally crushed the janitor, only to watch her rise from the wreckage of his own trap stronger than she'd been before he said it. Si-hun rose slowly from his seat at the back of the room as the investors began filing out, offering handshakes and quiet words of praise Janet barely registered through the ringing in her ears. He crossed the room and stood before her, something unreadable and deeply attentive in his eyes, the look of a man who had just watched a woman prove, beyond any doubt, exactly why he'd chosen her in the first place. "That wasn't in the plan," he said quietly. "No," Janet agreed, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the room had emptied and the adrenaline was draining out of her all at once. "It wasn't." "Someone in this building altered your files before this meeting," Si-hun said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous, the warmth gone entirely from his eyes. "Someone with direct access to your presentation, your login, your systems." He turned his head slightly toward the door where Min-jun had just exited, jaw tightening with a fury he was visibly working to control. "I intend to find out exactly who." Janet followed his gaze toward the empty doorway and felt, underneath the triumph still humming through her chest, the unmistakable cold certainty that she had just made an enemy who would not stop at sabotaged spreadsheets the next time he tried to bring her down. If you believe every service worker who's ever been underestimated deserves the kind of respect Janet just earned in that boardroom, hit that share button right now and send this to somebody who needs to see a woman rise the way she just did. Let's make sure everyone sees what happens when you underestimate someone who's spent her whole life being overlooked. The certainty settled into Janet's bones exactly 3 nights later, at 11:42 p.m., when the front window of her apartment exploded inward in a hailstorm of glass, and a sound like the whole building had cracked in half. Shattered glass rained onto the floor as Michael screamed her name from his bedroom, and Janet was moving before she'd even finished processing what she'd heard. Off the couch, across the living room, glass crunching under her bare feet, blood already welling from a shallow cut along her forearm that she wouldn't feel until hours later. 2 men in dark clothing were climbing through the shattered window frame, and in the half-second it took her mind to catch up with what her eyes were seeing, Janet understood with total, bone-deep clarity that this was not a robbery. These men hadn't come for anything she owned. They'd come for her. "Michael," her voice tore out of her raw and desperate as she reached his bedroom door, threw herself against it, pulling it shut and dragging the small dresser in front of it with strength she didn't know she had, her son's terrified sobs coming muffled through the wood. "Baby, stay down, stay away from the window. I need you to be brave for me right now." A hand closed around her arm from behind. Janet spun, ready to fight with everything she had, years of exhaustion and fear and love for her brother compressed into a single desperate swing, and connected with nothing but air as the man holding her was suddenly, violently, no longer there. He hit the wall 3 feet away with a sound that made her stomach turn, and standing where he'd been a heartbeat earlier was Si-hun, dressed not in the tailored suits she'd grown used to seeing him in, but in black, moving through her small apartment like something out of a nightmare given precise, controlled purpose. She hadn't even heard him arrive. She hadn't heard the front door. She would understand later that he hadn't used the front door at all. "Get to Michael," he said, voice low and utterly without panic, the calm of a man who had done this before more times than Janet ever wanted to know. Now. She didn't need to be told twice. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sounds of a fight that lasted less time than it took her to drag the dresser away from Michael's door again. A short, brutal exchange of movement and impact, and then silence, thick and sudden, broken only by her own ragged breathing and Michael's crying through the wall. She got the door open and Michael threw himself into her arms so hard it nearly knocked her backward, his small body shaking, his face buried in her shoulder. I heard glass breaking, Janet, I thought. I've got you." She held him tight enough to feel his heartbeat slamming against her own chest, tight enough to remind both their bodies that they were still alive, still together. "I've got you, baby. I'm right here." Si-hun appeared in the doorway, a moment later, and Janet's breath caught at what she saw behind him. 2 men on her living room floor, unmoving, and 3 more guards flooding in through her shattered front window with the kind of grim efficiency that told her this had all happened faster than a normal person could process, that the entire attack, from window to resolution, had taken less than 90 seconds. Si-hun stood in the doorway, shadow hanging over the fallen attackers behind him, and for a moment Janet saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the composed chairman from the boardroom, not the wounded stranger from the bakery counter, but something older and colder, something that had clearly been forged long before she'd ever met him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes moving over her quickly, catching the blood on her forearm before she'd even registered it herself. "I'm fine, Michael." She pulled back just far enough to check her brother's face, his wide, terrified eyes, thankfully unmarked, unhurt, just shaking with a fear no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. "Michael's fine." Si-hun's jaw tightened, something dangerous moving behind his composed exterior. "You're not staying here tonight, either of you." "Who were they?" Janet's voice cracked, adrenaline finally beginning to give way to something closer to shock, her legs trembling beneath her as the reality of what had almost happened caught up with her all at once. "Si-hun, who sent them?" He didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, Janet felt the full weight of a question she already knew the answer to, even as some small part of her wanted him to say a different name entirely. "You know who," he said finally, quiet and grim. The presentation was a warning he expected you to heed. This was his answer to the fact that you didn't. How many other families in this city had received the same kind of warning from Min-jun over the years? And how many of them had lived to tell it the way Janet just had? Within the hour, Janet found herself in the back of one of Si-hun's black SUVs. Michael curled against her side, wrapped in a blanket one of the guards had produced from somewhere, his small hand gripping hers so tightly it ached, both of them still in the same clothes they'd been wearing when the window shattered, neither of them having had the chance to pack a single thing. The city blurred past outside the window, streetlights smearing gold across the glass, and Janet stared at her own trembling hands in her lap, trying to reconcile the woman who'd stood in a boardroom 2 days ago speaking truth to power with the woman who just watched armed men climb through her living room window to hurt her family. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, once Michael's breathing had finally evened out into exhausted, fitful sleep against her shoulder. "A property of mine, outside the city, secure. My people will be watching every entrance." Si-hun sat across from her, his own hands still faintly stained with a fight she hadn't fully witnessed, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "You'll both be safe there while we sort out what comes next." "Sort out what comes next," Janet repeated, a bitter edge creeping into her exhausted voice. "Si-hun, I have a job. Michael has school. We can't just disappear into some estate in the countryside and pretend our whole lives didn't just get shattered along with my front window." "I understand that." His voice softened, just slightly, the first crack of genuine feeling she'd heard from him since the attack. "But I need time, Janet. Time to ensure this doesn't happen again. Time to make Min-jun understand in a language he can't misinterpret that touching your family carries consequences he isn't prepared for." Janet studied his face in the passing light, searching for the man who'd once knelt at a bakery counter, starving and humble and grateful for a single loaf of bread, and found instead someone harder, someone she wasn't entirely sure she recognized. And beneath her exhaustion and fear, a small, uncomfortable thought took root. That the same ruthlessness capable of protecting her and Michael tonight was the same ruthlessness that had built and defended an empire she still didn't fully understand. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. "I want this to stop. There's a difference." "I know." Something flickered across his face. Respect, maybe, or the particular weariness of a man being reminded of a moral line he'd stopped drawing for himself a long time ago. "And that difference is exactly why I need you now more than ever." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, deliberate. "Min-jun has spent years building a network of front companies, false permits, corrupted officials, the kind of infrastructure that survives even after the man behind it is gone. If I simply eliminate him, someone else steps into the vacuum within a month, and this entire cycle begins again. But if we expose the network itself, legally, publicly, with evidence no court can dismiss, then it doesn't just end," Janet finished slowly, understanding dawning even through her exhaustion. "It ends permanently." "Yes." Si-hun held her gaze, something almost pleading beneath his controlled exterior. a man asking for a kind of help he'd never had to ask for before from anyone. Tessa's files, combined with what you've already found in the maintenance budgets, combined with what happened tonight, we have enough now to begin building something that can bring him down without a single shot fired. But I need you, Janet. Not just your access to those buildings. Your judgment. Your instinct for exactly where the truth is hiding. His voice dropped lower, quieter, more honest than she'd heard him since the night he first stood in her living room offering her a life she'd never asked for. Will you help me finish this the right way? Janet looked down at her sleeping brother, at the small, trusting weight of him against her side, and thought of the shattered glass still scattered across her living room floor, of how close tonight had come to ending in something she couldn't bring herself to fully imagine. Yes, she said, and felt something inside her shift permanently as the word left her mouth, the last remnant of the woman who mopped floors and stayed silent and made herself small, giving way, finally and completely, to someone who understood that passivity was no longer a choice she could afford to make. But we do this my way. Evidence. Exposure. The truth in front of everyone where it can't be buried or threatened away. She met his eyes, steady now despite everything. You touched her family. You touched my family, Minjun. Her voice hardened into something Sihun had never heard from her before. That was your final mistake. Outside the window, the city lights gave way slowly to the darker, quieter roads leading out of Chicago, and somewhere behind them, in an apartment with a shattered window and blood still drying on the floor, the war that had been building in the shadows for weeks had just become impossible to ignore any longer. That promise carried Janet through the 2 weeks that followed, 2 weeks of quiet, methodical work, of cross-referencing Tessa's files against property filings, of building a case so airtight that no lawyer, no bribed official, no threat could tear it apart before the truth ever reached the light. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by one of Sihun's men in a plain envelope with no return address, a location, a time, and a single line that made Janet's stomach turn cold the moment she read it. All regional leadership. Mandatory attendance. Sihun had explained it to her the night before, his voice carefully controlled in a way that told her exactly how dangerous this gathering truly was. A summit held twice a year, bringing together every leader of every faction under the Il-Shin banner from 3 states, a room that would contain more accumulated violence and power than Janet had ever stood near in her life. You don't have to be there, Sihun had told her, sitting across from her at the safe house kitchen table, Michael long since asleep down the hall under the watch of 2 guards Janet had finally stopped flinching at the sight of. I can present the evidence myself. You've done the work that matters. The rest can be mine to finish. No, Janet had met his eyes without hesitation, surprising herself with how steady her own voice had become in the weeks since her window shattered. Minjun tried to burn my credibility in that boardroom, and when that didn't work, he tried to burn my home down with my brother inside it. I am not going to let him walk into a room full of powerful men and act like none of that happened, while I sit safely somewhere else. She'd folded her hands on the table, feeling the last of her old hesitation finally, fully burn away. He needs to see my face when the truth comes out. He needs to know exactly who brought him down. Now, standing in the marble-floored entrance of a private estate on the city's outskirts, dressed in a charcoal blazer that fit her like armor, Janet felt every one of those brave words tested by the sheer, suffocating weight of the room she was about to walk into. The summit chamber was enormous, ringed with dark wood paneling and low golden light, a long table at its center surrounded by perhaps 30 men, leaders from Detroit, from New York, from cities Janet had never had reason to think about, each one flanked by their own personal security, each one carrying themselves with the particular stillness of men who had survived by being more dangerous than the room around them. Sihun sat at the head of the table, composed, unreadable, and beside him, Minjun sat with the easy confidence of a man who had no idea the ground beneath him was about to give way entirely. Janet took her position along the wall behind Sihun, a slim folder held against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the man beside her could hear it. The meeting opened with the usual business, territorial updates, financial reports delivered in clipped, careful language, Nothing that meant anything to Janet's untrained ear, but everything, clearly, to the men around the table. And then, without warning, Min-jun rose from his seat. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "I think it's time this summit addressed a concern several of us have shared privately for weeks." His eyes moved deliberately toward Si-hun. "Our chairman's judgment has grown, unreliable since his return. He installs outsiders in positions of authority. He allows sentiment to guide decisions that should be governed by strength." A murmur rippled around the table, and Janet felt her stomach drop as she understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what was happening. "I propose a vote of confidence. Effective immediately, leadership of this organization should pass to someone whose judgment hasn't been compromised." Had Min-jun already secured enough votes around this table to seize control before anyone even understood what he was truly hiding? And if so, was Janet about to become the very reason his coup succeeded instead of failed? Si-hun rose slowly, his expression unreadable, dangerous in its stillness. "You would stage a coup in front of the entire leadership, Min-jun? Bold for a man with so much to hide." "I have nothing to hide." Min-jun's smile was thin, confident, a man who believed he'd already won. "Unlike you, Chairman, who elevated a former janitor to oversee millions in development capital based on nothing more than a moment of misplaced gratitude." Every eye in the room turned to the black woman standing fearless before armed mob bosses, and Janet felt the full, crushing weight of 30 pairs of eyes assessing her, weighing her, deciding in an instant whether she belonged in a room built entirely on power she'd never asked to understand. She stepped forward. "My name is Janet Milley," she said, and to her own quiet astonishment, her voice didn't shake. 8 weeks ago, I was cleaning floors for $11 an hour. I don't know your world, gentlemen. I don't know your history, your rivalries, your codes. But I do know how to read a financial statement, and I know how to recognize when numbers are lying." She opened her folder and stepped further into the light. "Which is exactly what I found, 3 weeks ago, buried in maintenance budgets nobody thought a janitor would ever think to examine." Min-jun's confident expression flickered, just slightly. "These files don't lie, gentlemen. Min-jun has been stealing from all of you." Janet laid the documents across the table, one after another, each page a piece of the case she'd spent weeks assembling with a precision no boardroom presentation could match. 3 shell companies, registered to properties this organization owns, moving product logged as medical waste through clinics on Chicago's South Side, clinics that serve the very communities this syndicate claims to protect. Insulin, chemotherapy drugs. Diverted, stolen, and resold, while patients who needed them went without. She let that settle before continuing, her voice hardening with every word. "And beneath that, a hazardous materials warehouse, fast-tracked for zoning approval against the chairman's explicit objections, positioned in exactly the district where those same diverted supplies would need a permanent, legal distribution point to keep moving without detection. This was never about real estate, gentlemen. Min-jun has been quietly building infrastructure to expand this operation into something far more profitable and far more dangerous than anything sanctioned by this table. And he has been stealing your resources, your territory, and your legitimacy to do it." The room had gone utterly, deathly silent. Around the table, Janet watched faces shift from curiosity to alarm to something closer to fury. Men who had trusted Min-jun's numbers for years now staring at proof that he had been siphoning from every one of them in service of an operation none of them had sanctioned or known about. "This is fabricated," Min-jun said, but his voice had lost its earlier smoothness, cracking at the edges. "A janitor's forgery designed to protect a chairman too weak to lead. The shipment manifests carry your shell company's registration numbers," Janet cut in, steady, unshaken. "The zoning applications carry your signature. The clinic's supply records were pulled directly by a whistleblower nurse who nearly lost her life for telling the truth. Every document in front of you can be independently verified within the hour by anyone at this table who wants to check." She looked directly at him now, refusing to let her voice waver even as her pulse thundered in her ears. "You didn't just steal from a syndicate, Min-jun. You endangered children needing chemotherapy to build a smuggling pipeline through my neighborhood, through my brother's neighborhood. And you sent men to my home to silence me before I could prove it." The silence that followed was absolute. Minjun's composure finally shattered entirely, something wild and cornered flashing across his face as he realized, in real time, that every ally around that table was recalculating their loyalty in front of him. His hand moved fast, reaching beneath his jacket, and the sound of a dozen weapons being drawn simultaneously from the security lining the walls filled the room like a single collective breath. "Put down the gun, Minjun," Si-hun said, his voice low and utterly without fear, stepping forward to stand beside Janet, placing himself deliberately between her and the barrel now leveled shakily in Minjun's trembling hand. "Your reign ends tonight, one way or another. The only choice left to you is how." Janet's heart slammed against her ribs, every instinct screaming at her to move, to run, to do anything but stand perfectly still in a room full of loaded weapons. But she held her ground beside the man who had once begged her for a moment's grace over a loaf of bread, watching Minjun's finger tighten, almost imperceptibly against the trigger, the entire room holding its breath in the space of a single, terrifying heartbeat. If you would have done exactly what Janet did all those weeks ago, spent your very last $3 to help a starving stranger nobody else would even look at, leave a comment right now, and let this community see just how many good hearts are still out there in this world. Janet's kindness built everything you're watching unfold tonight. Let's honor that. The gunshot never came. Instead, one of Si-hun's guards moved faster than Janet's eyes could follow, closing the distance and driving Minjun's arm upward a half-second before his finger completed its pull, the weapon discharging harmlessly into the ceiling in a deafening crack that sent plaster raining down over the table, and every man in the room diving for cover that, a heartbeat later, no longer seemed necessary. It was over in seconds. Minjun hit the floor hard, the guard's knee pinning him between the shoulder blades, the weapon kicked away and skidding beneath the long table where it came to rest against someone's polished shoe. Around the room, the other regional leaders slowly rose from where they ducked, straightening jackets, exchanging glances that had shifted entirely in the space of a single gunshot, no longer weighing whether to support Minjun's coup, but watching in stunned silence as the man who'd nearly seized control of their entire organization was dragged upright and forced to his knees in the center of the room he'd tried to claim as his own. Si-hun crossed the marble floor slowly, each step deliberate, and Janet watched something settle over his face that she hadn't seen since the night her window shattered. The same cold, ancient fury that had cleared her living room of armed men in under 90 seconds, now aimed directly at the man kneeling before him. He drew a weapon of his own. The room went utterly silent as Si-hun pressed the barrel against Minjun's forehead, and Janet felt the air leave her lungs entirely, watching a version of this man she'd only glimpsed in fragments finally step fully into the light. Not the wounded stranger from the bakery, not the composed chairman from the boardroom, but the man who had built and defended an empire through decades of exactly this kind of violence, standing now at the edge of a decision that would define everything that came after it. "You stole from every man in this room," Si-hun said, his voice low, terrible in its calm. "You endangered children who needed medicine to survive. You sent men into a woman's home, and you nearly murdered a 7-year-old boy sleeping 30 feet from where those bullets could have gone." His finger moved against the trigger guard, and Minjun's breathing turned ragged, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the raw, undignified fear of a man finally understanding the true weight of what he'd done. "In our world, betrayal like yours has always answered to one law." The cold steel pressed against Minjun's forehead, awaiting the final order, and every man in that room, 30 leaders who had built their lives on exactly this kind of justice, waited for what they clearly believed was inevitable. "Si-hun," Janet's voice cut through the silence, steadier than she felt, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it behind her eyes. She stepped forward, past the guards, past the men still frozen along the walls, until she stood close enough to see the tremor Si-hun was fighting to control in his own hand. "Don't." He didn't look at her, His eyes stayed fixed on Min-jun, jaw tight, the barrel unmoving. "You don't understand what he's earned, Janet. You don't understand what this world demands." "I understand exactly what he's earned," she said, and something in her voice made him finally, slowly, turn his head toward her. "I understand what he did to my home, to my brother, to a nurse who risked her life to tell the truth, to every family whose medicine he stole to line his own pockets. I'm not asking you to forgive him." She held Si-hun's gaze, unflinching, feeling the weight of 30 armed men watching her challenge the most dangerous man in the room. "I'm asking you to be better than him." Would the men in this room, whose entire world ran on the certainty that betrayal always ended in blood, even accept a different kind of justice? Or would sparing Min-jun's life cost Si-hun the very authority he just fought to reclaim? "If you kill him here," Janet continued, quieter now, her voice trembling with everything she'd carried since the night her window shattered, "in front of every leader in this organization, you prove every single thing he said about you was true. That strength only ever looks like violence, that this world can never actually change, no matter how much either of us wants it to." She glanced around the silent room, at the faces watching this moment unfold, then back to Si-hun, her voice steadying into something fierce and certain. "We become the very monsters we fought." Si-hun's hand didn't move. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing in the room moved at all, 30 men holding their breath, Min-jun trembling on his knees beneath a weapon that could end his life with a single twitch of muscle, Janet standing close enough to feel the tension radiating off Si-hun's entire body like heat off pavement in July. "He tried to kill you," Si-hun said, and for the first time his voice cracked, just slightly, revealing something underneath the cold fury, fear. Janet realized real fear. The terror of a man who had almost lost the one person who taught him mercy still existed in this world. "He sent men into your home. If that guard had been half a second slower tonight, you could have died standing beside me." "I didn't." Janet reached out slowly and closed her hand over the one holding the weapon, not pulling, not forcing, just steady, warm pressure, the same quiet touch she'd used to hand a starving stranger a loaf of bread months ago. "I'm still here. Michael is still here. And if we want any of this, the company, the community projects, the entire future you promised me when you offered me this life, to actually mean something, it has to start with proving that power in your hands looks different than power in his." Her voice dropped lower, meant for him alone even in a room full of witnesses. "Turn him over to the police. Let the evidence Tessa and I built speak for itself, in a courtroom, in daylight, where the whole world can see exactly what he did, and exactly why you stopped him without becoming him in the process." The silence stretched long enough that Janet began to believe, with a sinking, desperate certainty, that she'd asked for something even Si-hun's love for her couldn't override, that the code he'd lived by for decades ran too deep to be undone by one woman's conviction, however fiercely she believed in it. Then, slowly, the barrel lowered. For the first time in his life, the mafia boss lowered his weapon, not out of weakness, not out of fear, but out of a choice Janet watched settle over his face like something being rebuilt from the ground up in real time. Si-hun stepped back from Min-jun, holstering the gun with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and turned to face the room full of leaders who had just watched him choose a path none of them had ever seen him walk before. "Effective immediately," Si-hun said, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "This organization's leadership operates under new terms. Min-jun's crimes will be answered through legitimate channels, evidence, prosecution, consequence under the law, not blood spilled in this room tonight." He looked around at the assembled faces, some skeptical, some quietly, unmistakably relieved. "Any among you who believes strength only exists in violence is welcome to challenge that position directly with me. But you will find, as Min-jun just did, that I no longer intend to lead through fear alone." 2 of Si-hun's guards hauled Min-jun to his feet, and as they led him toward the door, toward a car that Janet knew, with grim satisfaction, was headed directly to the nearest federal building, where Tessa's files and Janet's meticulously built case were already waiting to end his freedom for a very long time. Min-jun turned his head one final time, his eyes finding Janet's across the room, something between hatred and disbelief still burning in his gaze. "You think mercy makes you strong," he spat, his voice raw with humiliation. "It makes you weak. It always has, it always will." Janet held his gaze without flinching, feeling something settle deep and permanent in her chest, not triumph exactly, but something steadier, something closer to peace. "No," she said quietly. "It makes me free." The guards pulled him through the doorway and out of sight, and the room slowly began to exhale, tension bleeding out of 30 armed men in a way that felt almost tangible, like a held breath finally released after months of pressure. Sihun crossed the floor back to where Janet stood, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had just happened settling between them in a silence that needed no words to fill it. "You could have let me finish it the old way," he said finally, quietly, searching her face for something he seemed almost afraid to name. "It would have been easier. It's what this world expects." "I didn't fall in love with easy," Janet said, and the word hung between them, unplanned, unguarded, more honest than either of them had allowed themselves to be until this exact moment. And watching the way Sihun's entire composed exterior finally, completely softened at those words, Janet realized, with a quiet and overwhelming certainty, that whatever came next for both of them was about to look nothing at all like the life either of them had ever expected to live. That word, love, turned out to be the truest thing either of them had said all year. And 1 year later, standing on the front porch of a house with her name on the deed, Janet found herself thinking that some sentences take 12 months to finish and are worth every single day of the wait. The house sat on Blue Island Avenue, 3 blocks from the apartment where a window had once shattered in the middle of the night, in a neighborhood that looked almost unrecognizable from the one Janet had grown up fighting to survive in. The warehouse project that would have poisoned Pilsen with Minjun's smuggling pipeline had been torn down within months of his arrest. The land repurposed instead into exactly what Janet had promised that boardroom full of investors: renovated housing. A rebuilt community center with heat that actually worked through the winter. A job training program that had already placed 43 local residents in stable, dignified work. Minjun's trial had been swift and thorough, Tessa's files and Janet's records forming a case so complete that even his own former allies testified against him rather than risk being pulled down with him. He was serving 40 years now, in a place with far fewer luxuries than the boardrooms he'd once ruled, and Janet found she rarely thought of him at all anymore, which, she'd come to understand, was its own kind of victory. She stood now on the porch of a house with fresh paint and a wraparound railing Michael had insisted on, holding a folded document in trembling hands, watching her brother. 8 years old now, taller, steadier, no longer flinching at every unexpected sound, the way he had in the months after that terrible night, bound up the front steps 2 at a time to see what she was holding. "What is it?" he asked, breathless, peering over her arm. "This," Janet said, her voice thick with something she'd been holding back all morning, "is the deed to this house, paid in full." She knelt down to his height, holding the document so he could see the words printed clearly across the top, words that had taken her a full year of work and worry and quiet, careful saving to make true. "No mortgage, no landlord, nobody who can ever tell us we have to leave." Her voice cracked just slightly on the next words. "This is ours, Michael, forever." The deed was stamped paid in full. No more fear, no more running, no more coffee tins counted 4 times a night praying the numbers would somehow be different than they were. Michael threw his arms around her neck, so hard it nearly knocked her off balance, and Janet held him there on the porch steps of their own home, letting herself feel, fully and without guard, the particular relief of a promise finally kept. Behind them, the front door opened, and Sihun stepped out onto the porch, not in the tailored suits of boardrooms anymore, though he still wore them often enough, but in something softer, a man who'd spent the last year learning, slowly and deliberately, how to exist in a world that didn't require armor at every turn. He watched Janet and Michael with an expression Janet had come to recognize as uniquely his. Quiet, careful joy. The look of a man who still occasionally seemed surprised that this particular kind of happiness had found its way into his life at all. "The community center renovation finished ahead of schedule," he said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a year's worth of mornings just like this one. The scholarship board approved the first 12 recipients this week, all from Pilsen, all service workers like you were, looking for a way forward. Janet smiled, watching Michael race down the porch steps toward the small garden she'd planted along the side of the house, tomatoes and peppers climbing steadily toward a Chicago summer neither of them had to spend afraid. 12, she repeated softly. That's 12 people who won't have to lose everything just to prove their worth investing in. Because of you, Si-hun said, turning to face her fully, his voice carrying the particular gravity he still reserved for moments that mattered most. None of this exists without the woman who spent her last $3 on a stranger who had nothing to offer her in return. Would the neighborhood and the wider city that had watched Janet's rise with equal parts fascination and skepticism ever fully believe that a former janitor could keep rebuilding a legacy this large, or would she spend the rest of her life proving it, one project at a time? She thought about that question often, in quieter moments, whether the doubt would ever fully fade, whether she'd always carry some small part of the woman who'd once believed she was meant to stay invisible. But standing here, on a porch that belonged entirely to her family, watching her brother laugh in a garden he'd helped plant with his own hands, Janet found she cared less than she once had about who believed in her and more about the work itself. The steady, patient work of building something that would outlast every doubt anyone had ever placed on her. Later that afternoon, Janet found herself walking the familiar stretch of Halden Street, past the marble counters and gleaming display cases of the bakery where her whole life had changed. The same bakery, though under entirely new management now, the old manager and cashier both long gone, quietly let go after word of what had happened there eventually made its way back through the neighborhood grapevine. Janet still stopped by sometimes, not out of bitterness, but because some part of her needed to remember exactly where she'd started, needed to keep that memory close as a compass for everything she'd built since. She noticed the new hire the moment she walked in, a young woman, maybe 19, in the same dark blue scrubs Janet herself had once worn, wiping down the same marble counters with the same careful, invisible diligence Janet remembered in her own hands. The girl glanced up as Janet approached, and something in her expression, a kind of tired, guarded wariness, struck Janet with sudden, sharp familiarity. "Long shift?" Janet asked gently. The girl nodded, exhaustion evident beneath her polite smile. "Double, actually, trying to save up for my little sister's tuition." She said it like an apology, like she expected the admission to be met with judgment rather than understanding. Janet felt something settle in her chest, warm and certain, recognizing in this stranger every version of herself she'd ever had to be, invisible, exhausted, quietly carrying weight nobody else in the room bothered to notice. She reached into her bag and pulled out a card, the same kind Si-hun's assistant had once left on her own kitchen counter a lifetime ago, and set it gently on the counter between them. "There's a scholarship program a few blocks from here," Janet said. "For service workers. No connections needed, no perfect resume, just somebody willing to work hard and given half a real chance." She smiled, watching recognition and cautious hope flicker across the young woman's tired face. "I think you'd be a wonderful fit." "Why me?" the girl asked, echoing, though she couldn't have known it, the exact question Janet herself had once asked a stranger in a torn brown coat. "Because somebody once believed in me when I had every reason to believe nobody ever would," Janet said simply. "And I promised myself I'd spend the rest of my life paying that forward, one person at a time." She walked out of the bakery into the golden light of a late Chicago afternoon, past the same counter where she'd once handed a starving stranger a loaf of bread with her very last $3, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that every hard year, every humiliation, every moment she'd nearly broken under the weight of what the world expected her to accept, all of it had led, deliberately and undeniably, to exactly this: a home with no more fear in it. A brother who slept soundly through the night. A community rebuilding itself, brick by brick, scholarship by scholarship, into something worthy of the people who'd always deserved better than what they'd been given. She wore a designer blazer now, tailored and precise, nothing like the thrift store find she'd worn to her first boardroom meeting, but her hands still remembered the weight of the mop, still remembered exactly what it felt like to be overlooked, and she made sure, every single day, that memory shaped every decision she made in rooms full of people who'd once looked at her like she didn't belong there. Kindness isn't weakness, Janet thought, walking home toward a family and a life she'd built out of nothing but her own unwavering dignity. It's the strongest currency on earth, and she intended to spend the rest of her life proving exactly that to anyone who still doubted it. If Janet's journey from an invisible janitor to an unstoppable force for good moved you even half as much as it moved me, subscribe right now and stay close, because there are more stories like hers waiting to remind you exactly what real strength looks like. And if you're not ready to let go of stories like this one just yet, I have something waiting for you. A novel collection with 2 more unforgettable journeys of love, loss, and the kind of hope that survives absolutely everything. One story will break your heart wide open. The other will heal it completely. It's an instant download, with a free audiobook included, and it's ready for you right now. Just follow the link in the description and the pinned comment. And if you're settled in on your couch tonight watching this on your TV, go ahead and pick up your phone, scan the QR code right there on your screen, and let yourself fall into another story worth remembering. You've earned it.